Andy Boyd, welcome to the State Secrets Podcast.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm very happy to be here.
I want to just jump in by kind of clearing up the battle space here, for lack of a better word. There are a lot of government agencies that play key roles in cyber today, as you well know. I'm particularly interested in CIA's Center for Cyber Intelligence, which you led. What is the center's purpose, Andy? And it has an interesting sort of operational component of it. Tell me about that too.
Yeah, so I retired at the end of September 2023 as the director of CIA Center for Cyber Intelligence. I've been in that job since January 2020. I'd spent the bulk of my career as an Arabic-speaking case officer, mostly in the counterterrorism space. My job immediately prior to that was chief of operations for counterterrorism. But like you said, CCI is a center, just like there's other centers for mission in CIA. And we do, if it involves cyber, either strategic analysis, operations, or the technological innovation that goes into operations or analysis in internet protocol space, that is what happens at CCI. Like other centers in CIA, we have a whole bunch of analysts who write PDB, Presidential Daily Briefs, for the Oval Office, all the way down to analytic products that really inform our next operational cycle. We have folks that do what we call computer network exploitation operations, as well as, and this is unique to CIA in the cyber community, both the intel community, cyber entities, as well as the rest of the cyber community in the US government. We have one foot in the human intelligence camp and one foot in the technical operations camp, which, frankly, in this epoch makes us a very, very unique player in the intel community and a sought after partner within the U.S. government, but also with our allied partners.
But this isn't the same thing that NSA does, for example, with signals intelligence.
No, and there's an open debate as to, in 2023, 2024, what is signals intelligence? Because, I mean, a lot of the signals that you get over the air in, years past, you really don't. You get through computer network exploitation and whatnot. So there is an open debate as to what is SIGINT, what is technically enabled human intelligence, and what is human-enabled technical intelligence, and vice versa. But that's okay. Because there's a lot of work in that space, and what we do is complementary. We, being my former employer, what CCI does is complementary and additive to what the entire cyber SIGINT apparatus, and we have a deep, deep partnership with NSA across the board, across the leadership. And I'd just like to say, Paul Nakasone just retired as the commander of Cyber Command / director of NSA, and he helped pave the way for those deep, deep partnerships between CIA and NSA. And his successor, Tim Hawk, an Air Force 4-star general who I have a deep relationship with, is going to continue that. So there's nothing duplicative about the mission. It's all complementary.
Yeah. I'd love to take you for a little walk around the world, if you will, when we're talking about kind of threats to the United States right now, particularly threats that we know emanate from some core countries. Where would you like to start this trip around the world?
Well, when I have this conversation, I tend to go from the gold medal winners down to the bronze. With China being the People's Republic of China being on top of that. But I'd like to kind of go in reverse because there's a lot more to talk about on China. And how I couch this is that most nation states have a cyber tools either within the government or within the civilian structure, and they all apply them differently. And I'll start with North Korea. Why North Korea is a threat? Because to evade sanctions, but to continue to fund their weapons programs, they're involved in a great deal of cryptocurrency theft and fiat currency theft by using their cyber tools to hack into financial institutions. That hasn't happened a lot lately. It's mostly been cryptocurrency thievery, but to the tune of billions of dollars. And you can fund quite a bit of weapons programs by doing that. Every once in a while, they use their cyber tools for other activity. If they get annoyed by various companies around the world, the hack of Sony may come to mind when there was a movie that was contrary to the dear leader's intentions in the DPRK, and that was they hacked into Sony and released a whole bunch of intellectual property from Sony. But those are one-offs. Really, what their core is to fund the regime because the sanctions have made that impossible. The Iranians have a number of cyber tools, and the Israelis and the Iranians exchange sort of cyber attacks, so to speak. Um, but and again, this is not a position of advocacy; it's just a strategic analysis point. The Iranians are very adept at using their cyber tools in the realm of coercive diplomacy. And the best example of that is how they use their tools against the Albanian government, essentially to express their displeasure with the Albanians hosting the Mujahideen al-Halq, which is an opposition group. And they succeeded in getting the Albanians' attention, the Albanians questioning their decision making on whether they should continue to host the MEK. Russia. So, when you compare Russia and China, my friend Rob Joyce up at NSA is always and I've taken this phrase or metaphor from him. You can always think about in cyber terms, China being climate change and Russia being a tornado. Russia's goals with some of their disruptive and destructive cyber tools is sort of to create mayhem in the post World War II international structure as we know it. They also obviously use their cyber tools for intelligence collection. Each one of these services within the Russian government uses their tools differently. The SVR, an intelligence collection organization, the GRU and FSB, very different. And as evidenced in February 2022, the Russians tried to use their cyber tools as a supporting fire, so to speak, in their invasion of Ukraine. Now, in the beginning, the day before the invasion, they conducted a hack against Viasat, which was a communications tool used by the Ukrainians, and it was moderately successful for a bit. But in general, the Russians' attacks against Ukraine sort of put the intel community analytic entities and the private sector, made us all kind of take a step back and wonder, did we understand or evaluate incorrectly what the Russian tools were? And I would argue we haven't, but what we didn't factor in is that over the past decade, the Ukrainians have gotten used to cyber attacks, and as a result, they've become pretty good at cyber defense. And so we have to give them the credit for that. But what we've also, started reevaluating is how complicated offensive cyber operations are, because most of the Russian cyber operations were not particularly impactful. They would take down internet service providers for a day, and then they'd be back up. They'd attempt at cyber attacks against the electric grids in Ukraine, but because of the lessons learned in 2014 and 2017, the Ukrainians had hardened their infrastructure, again, with a lot of help from the private sector around the world, principally from the United States. But the Russian tools, such as they are for disruptive and destructive cyber, weren't what we thought they would be. Thirdly, there's another hypothesis that the Russians actually didn't employ all of their offensive cyber tools because, like any other intelligence service, they needed some of those networks to be running for intelligence collection purposes and to communicate with their troops in Ukraine post-invasion. So that's and the Russians, on their attacks against the United States, such as they are, they're not necessarily they're capable of executing cyber attacks. But what in the past, since the SolarWinds hack, they've really been using their tools for intelligence collection. The SVR in particular, hacking into tools like SolarWinds or other U.S. government networks to steal information to inform their policy decisions. There's only one real policymaker that matters in Russia, and that's Vladimir Putin, but he still needs intelligence collected to inform his decision making. Forward now to China, and this has been the discussion over the past 2 weeks in Washington, particularly today, as the Department of Homeland Security released more details about the threat from the PRC. But writ large, the Chinese have the biggest cyber program in the world. I would argue the United States government and our private sector have much greater capability, but what the Chinese have is just a capability of throwing an enormous amount of human beings at these problems. And the Chinese have used their tools to steal intellectual property from the defense industrial base, to steal intellectual property from everything from healthcare all the way up through our COVID vaccines Back when Operation Warp Speed was going on, and Merck and Pfizer were developing their vaccines, they stole that intellectual property as well, which again, the PRC may not consider that intelligence collection, but I do. And it's intelligence collection with the intent of leapfrogging ahead of the United States and using all of our research and development capability, again, in the defense sector and the health sector and every other sector, and so, advance a couple of decades beyond without having to do that research and development themselves. In addition, the Chinese use their cyber tools to do what we would call in the U.S. preparation of the battlefield, and that has been the most recent discussion. And Microsoft has put the term Vault Typhoon out there, which is essentially the PRC intelligence apparatus pre-positioning tools in U.S. critical infrastructure. In the event that they need to conduct disruptive or destructive attacks in the ramp up to any conflict between the PRC and the United States. That has now, we in the intelligence community have been tracking that for quite a while. Microsoft and other U.S. private sector companies have been tracking that quite a while, but then it became public discussion. And most recently, last week, with General Nakasone, kind of his last act as director of NSA and commander of Cyber Command, along with FBI Director Christopher Wray, our new national cyber director and CIA NSA veteran Harry Coker, and then Jen Easterly, who's the director of DHS CISA, had an open hearing in front of Congress where they went through the details of all of that and what it means and what the Chinese threat poses to critical infrastructure, electric grids, water treatment systems, U.S. military installations, and the like. And it was a very valuable, again, for Congress, for folks inside the policy community of the United States. But that message was also intended for the private sector because, all of the networks that are relevant, the overwhelming majority of them are owned by the private sector. And this message was as critical to the private sector as it was to the U.S. government consumer of that message.
And you just recently retired, so you're pretty much in the know and up to date on things. But when that China threat has really been decades in the making, as you said, the intelligence communities and a lot of these leading private sector companies have known about what China is trying to do when it comes to U.S. infrastructure for quite a while. So I'm curious to know, were there any surprises for you or anything new or different out of that hearing? It got a lot of headlines, but they were mostly for people who maybe aren't paying close enough attention.
I think what was new was the emphasis on certain things, and Jen Easterly, again the director of CISA, had some brilliant commentary that is available to all of your listeners out there. But her key point was what we're talking about with Volt Typhoon and the threat to critical infrastructure. She assesses, and I think correctly, to be just the tip of the iceberg. And the reason that that is important is so that the private sector can absorb that message. And I'm not talking about elements of the private sector like Microsoft who have been involved in discussions with the government for quite some time. But we have a very large tech industry in the United States. It's for everybody else who hasn't been part of that discussion. Um, and there's a very succinct way to think about this. In the cybersecurity world, we always talk about villains and victims, and the villains being and I mean that in a metaphorical sort of way, but the villains being nation state actors and non-nation state actors, ransomware actors, criminal cyber actors. Frequently, ransomware actors and criminal cyber actors at least have a dotted line relationship with state actors in the context of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Those are the villains. The victims are, in the case of Typhoon, our critical infrastructure and aspects of our military bases. But they're also you and I with computers and telephones. We can be victims of either nation state or non-nation state cyber threats. So we focus on victims and villains. What the real focus and the real goal of last week's testimony and then the continuing release of information up to including a couple hours ago is to focus on the vendors, the three V's: villains, victims, and vendors. And the vendors are all the commercial providers of software and hardware, but really focusing on the software companies, wherein, for decades, software has not necessarily been secure by design. It's been designed to get to market quickly, to have functionality that whatever the customer base is for said software performs, to the satisfaction of the customer. But it wasn't built with security in mind, unlike airplanes, cars, other devices are designed with safety in mind because of the product liability, and there hasn't been product liability issues in software. So I think that is the sea change, is really trying to get vendors to focus on, again, what CISA is calling secure by design, having a software bill of materials when software is designed. And eventually, I think getting around to legislation where there is liability if you don't build software with the intent of being secure from the get-go and secure by design.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to ask a couple of questions on this kind of trip around the world before we move on from this, about some things kind of ripped from the headlines and, a lot of the open source stories that the Cipher Brief puts out every day. Let me get specific on a couple. Let's talk about Iran for a moment. Iran traditionally has used its cyber against government, private sector. I'm curious to get your thoughts on whether the cyber retaliation might be a way that Iran could retaliate for the recent strikes against Iranian proxies in the region.
In theory, I again like the context in February 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's hard to pull off. Were Iranian groups and their proxies in our water networks in Pennsylvania and Texas recently? Yes, they were. Was it a devastating issue? No, it was disruptive. But if that's the best they got, then I think we'll be okay. I mean, again, disruptive and destructive cyber attacks and effects operations are very difficult to pull off. Does that mean the Iranians can't do it? No, no, they could, but would it have the impact that a kinetic attack from the Iranians would have on our troops in the region or whatnot? It just wouldn't be the same scale. So if that was all the Iranians did in response, which again I'm not so sure that they're interested in retaliating on behalf of their proxy groups in Syria and Iraq. I honestly think they want to fight the U.S. to the last Iraqi. That's probably what they want to do to avoid actually a real war with the United States. But if
Yeah.
they did want to retaliate on behalf of their proxies, a minor cyber attack would certainly be a way to do it, where where the Iranians would be making a gesture but not really having much of an enduring impact.
So what's motivating these sort of, hacking of water facilities? Like, what do they want out of this?
I think they want to I mean, again, the General Nakasone at NSA, and I'm sorry, in his role as commander of Cyber Command, used this term persistent engagement. I think this is the Iranians' version of persistent engagement, persistently saying, okay, we're here, we can get to you if we want, we can collect intelligence from your network, and in theory, if we chose to, we could disrupt your water infrastructure or whatnot. Um, and that's not necessarily untrue. It's just for that to be an enduring and effective attack, I just don't think they have that capability right now. Could
Yeah.
they reveal that capability in another context? Or if there was an all-out war between Iran and the United States, yes, certainly. But this persistent, what they perceive as persistent engagement, is a nuisance. But in my mind, it's not an act of war.
Yeah, you've got elections coming up this year in this country. A lot of focus on the outcome of this election. A lot of interested parties around the world, and you've got Russia and China both actually with pretty advanced capabilities when it comes to disinformation campaigns and things like that. How are you seeing them use cyber to influence elections?
Well, that is the key, Suzanne, is they're using cyber. I mean, there's been disinformation campaigns either in wartime or in the lead up to wartime, or during election cycles or in other political contexts since the dawn of time. It's just in the past few years that there's been use of cyber tools. Will it continue? Yes. Will it be, using and particularly in 2023, 2024, utilizing social media to influence. And I think the perfect example of this is since October 7th, with the Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel. We think the Chinese have been using social media to influence American opinion about that, and particularly our youth. I mean, there's been this sort of mystifying support from 20 somethings for Hamas. Where is that coming from? In part, I think it's coming from disinformation campaigns on social media that are driven by the PRC to sort of sow disruption in American society. Can those same tools be turned into on a disinformation campaign en route to the elections? Yes, I think they can. But the first time we started talking about this as a society of late, it was in 2016. 2024, we have a lot more sophistication as an understanding, but and quite a bit of dialogue in the public sphere about this. So I think we're much better prepared to deal with it. And I think DHS CISA, again, in addition to cybersecurity, the infrastructure security for elections also falls under Jen Easterly. Um, and I think we're much better prepared for it. We have interagency task force that are tasked to deal with this issue from an intelligence collection and analysis perspective, but also from a cyber defense perspective. Is that going to be a panacea for all of it? Probably not, but we are much better prepared.
I want to talk to you for just a minute about the complexity of the cyber threat today. Would you even have imagined that we would be where we are today 15 or 20 years ago?
No, it's quite astounding, frankly. I mean, back to our discussion of where I came from as our director of CCI. In 2015, we renamed it from the Information Operations Center to the Center for Cyber Intelligence. But there's been a cyber component of CIA, since internet protocol space stood up. But you know, 20 years ago, it was a fairly niche outfit that was primarily focused on supporting the war on terror. Now it's everywhere. I mean, everybody wants in on the cyber game in the intelligence community, both to support their analytic conclusions, but also for intelligence collection operations. Extend that to the entire planet. We live our lives on the internet. You and I are currently having this discussion on the internet. We're on our phones all day, and so as a result, criminals or nation state actors have gone to where the information is, or where the infrastructure is. So yes, I mean the cyber attack surface, so to speak, has grown so large that it's now not only handsets, the computer that you and I are talking on, but it's the Internet of Things devices. Our refrigerators, our cars are basically computers. So the attack surface is basically everything, and as a result, there's a lot of threats out there. That being said, I do think we're in an epoch where the cyber defense, is in the ascendant. And there's a lot of companies out there doing an enormous amount of innovation. People keep talking about how artificial intelligence and machine learning is also going to add a layer of threat. And that's not untrue. The kind of spear phishing emails one gets that you could tell were written by somebody who didn't really speak English. You're going to be able to use ChatGPT or other AI tools to write those in idiomatically correct English. And if you don't have hacking skills or an ability to build an exploit, you can probably get code written by an AI bot to do that, and then basically unskilled labor doing spear phishing attacks. That will happen, but defensive tools are also going to be able to defensive companies are going to be able to use AI ML. The U.S. government's going to be able to use that. So I do think we're in a pretty good spot from a defensive perspective. Add that next layer. We obviously have a policy community and the executive branch that's very focused on this, as evidenced by the hearings last week. And I am very hopeful, maybe I shouldn't be, but I'm very hopeful that in 2024 we're going to get the legislative support from the federal government to then help us execute those policies, to put in laws that do require secure by design, from software companies, so that all the cylinders are firing together in the U.S. government and the private sector on that. So I'm pretty hopeful for 2024.
So it's probably too far for me to ask you to project forward 15 or 20 years. Let's just go 5 without my brain exploding. Someone who's a little bit more knowledgeable on these issues and has a more calm demeanor about it. What do you see happening in the next 5 years that we really should be focusing on without the need for hearings like the one we just heard recently?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the AIML issue. We've gone through various phases on this over the past year when ChatGPT became a public thing, and people were afraid we were going to build, robots that were going to take over the world. I think there's going to be much more practical applications of AIML. I think from an there was also the bit. I have young kids, teenagers. There's a lot of fear that they were going to cheat on their homework and cheat on their papers with ChatGPT. I'm not concerned about that really. A matter of fact, I think it's going to accelerate education and allow at the teenage level teachers, and then in the university level, let professors allow the students to learn certain things outside of the classroom using AI tools so that they can focus on more important things. And so I think it's going to be an accelerant for education. I think it's going to be an accelerant for writing software. The software, secure by design. If you can rely on AI ML to focus on fixing software issues, I mean, what an amazing advancement. Now, um, again, back to what the federal government is doing, we have put out a roadmap with the executive order on AI that was just released by the White House, a roadmap as to where we should go, because it's not without risk, it's not without threats. There are a whole variety of things that, if we don't do it correctly, could end up, hurting society, affecting people, the labor market, affecting people's jobs. But I think we have a roadmap, and people are being very thoughtful about that, both in government and in the private sector. And so within the next 5 years, I think, all the scare people are going to look back about AI. People are going to look back on that and kind of have a chuckle and say, okay, this tool is an epochal changing thing, just like the internet was, just like the invention of the computer was. But it's not, a doom and gloom, and it's not a major threat to humanity if we manage it correctly. So,
Let me close our conversation by asking you a couple of quick sort of personal questions here. When I was first introduced to you and given your role as the former director of the Center for Cyber Intelligence, I thought, okay, he's kind of one of those nerdy, ultra smart people, which you are ultra smart. You can decide if you're nerdy or not. But you also came up through the Directorate of Operations. You have this really interesting mix, Andy, of a background of sort of like, I don't know, what would you call yourself? Like, I hate to say James Bond people because people always cringe when I use that term, but you were out and running operations. You were really heavily involved in counterterrorism and things like that. And then all of a sudden you've got, this huge cyber layer and technology. I think you're a bit of a what? Maybe
so
a
I'm
simple.
not an engineer by education. I had a bit of engineering. I went to the Air Force Academy for my undergrad, so I did a bit of engineering, enough to be dangerous. The test for whether you're a nerd or a geek in CCI is whether you can quote every Star Wars movie, or quote every Douglas Adams book, and I can do that. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and stuff like that. I can do that. My former deputy thought it was an act, but it wasn't. I actually really liked that sort of stuff. So, I won over my workforce by being that kind of nerd and that kind of a dork. But really, I mean, I think, for me, evolving from being an Arabic speaking case officer, serving in the Arab world, doing a lot of counterterrorism operations, and then in the latter stage of my career, migrating over to the cyber business, I think is indicative of how we moved as a service in the Directorate of Operations, where you had to have technical expertise, you had to have domain expertise, be it, if your expertise was in the Middle East or East Asia or Europe, Russia, wherever it might be, but you had to do both. You couldn't be just a human guy. You couldn't just be a technical expert. You had to do both. And if you didn't, you'd sort of be left behind. And so I was able to see that, and I embraced. I had to read a lot. I had to take a lot of classes. I had to talk to all these experts to just absorb it, to have the credibility to lead CCI. But I do think it's an example of where we're evolving as an organization. And again, to your point, where are we going to be in 5 years? I mean, I think we're going to have a DO. Other components of the agency already have this technical expertise, but as a DO, the average case officer in the DO or targeter or collection management officer is going to look very, very different and is going to have technical skills that my peers never had. In addition to their language skills, their ability to work in austere environments, and their ability to understand ambiguity and risk, they're just going to have an added component. And as a result, I think 5 years from now, the average mid-career operations officer is going to be stronger than me and my peers were throughout our careers. So
It's fascinating to see the evolution and how it's changing not just the organization, but the people who work inside the organization as well. All right, so I want to end on the nerd thing because I'm still fascinated by that. You mentioned Star Wars. So what recommended watching or reading do you have for us?
so if you're gonna the origins of Intel community use of cyber tools, there's a book called The Cuckoo's Egg. So I recommend, and it was written quite a while ago. But I recommend that if you want to really sort of see where did cyber conflict start. That was a hack of Lawrence Livermore Labs back in the 80s, and that's a fascinating book. And then going on from there, listen to all the podcasts, and there's a ton of them. The Cyberwire Daily, the from N2K Networks, Risky Biz. But there's a whole lot of podcasts out there that are not engineering podcasts; they're cyber podcasts, but they're very understandable for the average listener. And if you're interested in upskilling to understand what it is that we talk about in the cyber world, you can do it listening to podcasts while you're driving to work or in the gym or whatnot. But I recommend everybody doing it, because if you're going to get left behind, not just in the DO, but in the entire security industry, if you don't understand this sort of thing.
And
So,
you mentioned Star Wars, so I'm wondering if future Jedi also have to have the ability to hack.
um, you don't have to have the ability to hack. You have to understand how it works. And there are SANS courses out there, where you can do them online and just sort of understand from tooth to tail how an offensive computer network exploitation operation works. I recommend it. If me as a political scientist and historian was able to do it, I think anybody can do it.
I always love talking to you. We could just make it a 4-hour podcast very easily.
There you
And
go.
Boyd, thank you so much for stopping by the State Secrets podcast. It's great to have you here, and the Cipher Brief is honored to have you as one of our newest experts.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much, Suzanne.